I never intended to become a guardian to a groundhog. Life has a way of inserting the most unexpected chapters into our stories when we least expect them. It was early spring, that fleeting moment when winter's grip loosens but hasn't fully released. The forest floor was a patchwork of melting snow and exposed earth, releasing that unmistakable scent of thawing soil and new possibilities. I was walking along my usual trail, camera in hand, hoping to capture the first wildflowers of the season. That's when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it beneath the whisper of wind through bare branches. A tiny, desperate squeak. I froze, listening intently, wondering if I had imagined it. There it was again. I followed the sound off the path, carefully stepping over fallen logs and dodging thorny brambles. In a small clearing near the base of an old oak tree, I saw movement. Something small, brown, and trembling. "Oh my God," I whispered, crouching down for a closer look. A baby groundhog, no bigger than my palm, was huddled against the exposed roots of the tree. Its eyes were barely open, its fur matted and dirty. It was shivering violently, making that heart-wrenching squeaking sound that had caught my attention. "Where's your mama, little one?" I scanned the area, looking for signs of a burrow, a protective mother, anything that would indicate this baby wasn't alone in the world. But there was nothing. Just the vast, indifferent forest and this tiny, fragile life. I gently brushed my finger against its back. The little creature flinched but didn't run. It couldn't. It was too weak, too cold, too everything. Its tiny body was burning through the last of its reserves just to stay alive. "It's freezing out here," I said to no one in particular, feeling the biting chill seeping through my own jacket. "You can't survive like this." I had a choice to make. I could leave it, trusting in nature's harsh wisdom that decides which creatures live and which don't. Or I could intervene. The groundhog squeaked again, a sound so full of need that it made my decision for me. "Okay, little one," I whispered, carefully slipping off my scarf. "I'm going to help you." Getting the baby groundhog home was the easy part. I wrapped it gently in my scarf, creating a makeshift nest that I cradled against my chest. I could feel its tiny heart racing against my palm, a frantic drumbeat of fear and exhaustion. "It's okay," I murmured, though I wasn't sure if I was reassuring the groundhog or myself. "We're going to figure this out." The hard part began when I got home. I had rescued injured birds before, even nursed a baby rabbit back to health once. But a groundhog? I had no idea what they ate, how often they needed to be fed, or what temperature they needed to be kept at. I placed the scarf-wrapped bundle in a small cardboard box lined with a heating pad set to low and covered with a soft towel. The baby groundhog, I decided to call him Acorn for now, was so still that for a terrifying moment I thought I'd lost him already. Then one tiny paw twitched, and I let out the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I spent the next hour researching frantically. Groundhogs, also called woodchucks, are herbivores. Babies need to be fed every 2 to 3 hours. They need specialized formula similar to what you'd use for kittens, but diluted. They can't regulate their own body temperature. The list of needs was overwhelming. "What have I gotten myself into?" I whispered, looking over at the box where Acorn lay trembling. His eyes, now slightly more open, met mine. There was something in that gaze. Not understanding, exactly, but a desperate trust that pierced right through me. "I'm not going to let you down," I promised. The next 3 days were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding. I mixed the formula according to the wildlife rehabilitator's instructions I'd found online, warming it to body temperature and testing it on my wrist like you would for a human baby. Using a tiny syringe with the needle removed, I carefully fed Acorn drop by drop. The first feeding was the hardest. Acorn was too weak to suckle properly, and I feared he might aspirate the formula. I persisted, my hands shaking with the responsibility of this tiny life. "Come on, buddy," I coaxed, a drop of formula balanced on the tip of the syringe. Just a little bit. After what felt like hours, Acorn took his first real swallow. It was a small victory, but in that moment, it felt monumental. Night was the worst. I set alarms every 2 hours to feed him, stumbling out of bed in the darkness, bleary-eyed but determined. During one particularly difficult 3 a.m. feeding, Acorn refused to eat. He lay listlessly in his box, his breathing shallow. "Please," I begged, tears forming in my eyes. "Please don't give up." I held him against my chest, feeling his tiny body next to my heartbeat, willing my own warmth and life force to flow into him somehow. I must have fallen asleep like that, because the next thing I knew, dawn was breaking through my window, and Acorn was stirring in my hands. He was still alive. We had made it through the night. By the end of the first week, Acorn had doubled in size. His fur was cleaner now, a rich brown that gleamed in the sunlight that streamed through my kitchen window. His eyes were fully open, bright and alert, taking in the world with unmistakable curiosity. He had graduated from his cardboard box to a larger plastic container with proper bedding, toys, and a hide box. I'd even added branches and leaves from outside to give him something familiar to explore. Feeding time had transformed from a stressful ordeal to something I looked forward to. Acorn would scramble to the edge of his container when he saw me approach with the syringe, his little paws reaching up in anticipation. "You're a greedy little thing, aren't you?" I laughed as he eagerly lapped at the formula. "Slow down, it's not going anywhere." After feeding, we had what I called exploration time. I would sit on the floor of my living room, creating a safe space with pillows and blankets where Acorn could practice his walking and climbing skills. At first, he was hesitant, sticking close to my legs and scurrying back to me at the slightest noise. But day by day, his confidence grew. He started to exhibit what I could only describe as playfulness, darting beneath the couch, then popping out unexpectedly, or climbing up my arm to perch on my shoulder like a tiny, furry parrot. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after I'd found him, Acorn did something that stopped my heart. He was exploring farther than usual, investigating a potted plant across the room. Suddenly, he stood up on his hind legs, perfectly balanced, and looked directly at me. Then, to my astonishment, he made a soft chirping sound. Not a squeak of distress, but something almost like a greeting. I chirped back, feeling ridiculous but unable to help myself. Acorn tilted his head, seemingly considering this exchange, then dropped back to all fours and continued his exploration. That was the moment I realized I was in trouble. I was getting attached. Too attached. As spring deepened into early summer, Acorn flourished. He was weaned off formula and onto a diet of fresh vegetables, fruits, and specialized rodent food. His container had been upgraded several times, eventually becoming a large pen that took up a significant portion of my spare room. He had developed a distinct personality. Stubborn, curious, with an unexpected playful streak that manifested in what I called popcorn jumps, where he would bounce straight up in the air for no apparent reason other than the joy of movement. But I knew our time together was temporary. Acorn was a wild animal, not a pet. The goal had always been rehabilitation and release. I had even contacted a wildlife center for advice, and they had given me a timeline. When he reached a certain size and demonstrated specific behaviors, it would be time to let him go. That day came faster than I was prepared for. Acorn now weighed several pounds, his body strong and healthy. He had developed all the natural behaviors of a groundhog: digging, foraging, even showing appropriate wariness of unfamiliar sounds and movements. The Wildlife Center had helped me find a perfect release site, a protected area with existing groundhog colonies away from roads and human development. The morning of the release, I sat beside Acorn's pen, watching him methodically shred a piece of lettuce. "Today's the day, buddy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You're going home." Acorn paused in his eating, looking up at me with those bright eyes that had once been so weak they could barely open. Did he understand? Of course not. And yet, there was something in that gaze that made my heart contract painfully. The drive to the release site was quiet. Acorn sat in his travel carrier, occasionally shifting or making soft scratching sounds. I had the radio off, wanting to memorize every moment of these last few hours together. The site was beautiful. A rolling meadow bordered by forest with wildflowers nodding in the summer breeze. I carried the carrier to a spot near the edge of the woods, where I'd been told other groundhogs had their burrows. "This is it," I said, kneeling down and opening the carrier door. "Your new home?" I expected Acorn to bolt immediately, to run toward freedom without a backward glance. But he didn't. He emerged cautiously, sniffing the air, his whiskers twitching as he processed this new environment. He took a few tentative steps, then looked back at me as if asking if this was okay, if he was doing the right thing. "Go on," I encouraged, my vision blurring with unshed tears. "It's okay." Acorn ventured a little farther, then a little farther still. He discovered a patch of clover and began to nibble, still glancing back at me every few seconds. I remained perfectly still, knowing that my presence was now a hindrance rather than a help. He needed to connect with this place, to begin seeing it as home. After about 20 minutes, Acorn had wandered about 30 feet away. He seemed more confident now, digging experimentally in the soil, exploring the base of a fallen log. I knew it was time for me to leave. "Goodbye, Acorn," I whispered, standing slowly. "Be safe out here." As if he heard me, Acorn looked up, our eyes meeting one last time across the distance that separated us. A distance that represented not just physical space, but the unbridgeable gap between our worlds. He stood on his hind legs, perfectly balanced, just as he had that day in my living room, silhouetted against the summer sky. Then he dropped down and disappeared into the tall grass. I visit the release site sometimes, though I know the chances of seeing Acorn are slim to none. Groundhogs are territorial, but they also range widely, and there's no way to know where he's established his home. Still, I come. I sit quietly at the edge of the meadow, watching the grass sway in the breeze, listening to the chorus of insects and birds. Once I thought I saw a brown shape dart between two logs at the forest's edge, but it was gone before I could be sure. It doesn't matter if I see him or not. What matters is that somewhere out there, a groundhog is living the life he was meant to live. Digging burrows, foraging for food, perhaps even raising young of his own. And he's doing it because one cold spring morning, I happened to hear a tiny squeak and chose to follow it. People often ask me why I went to such lengths for a groundhog, of all creatures. Why spend weeks of sleepless nights? Why invest so much emotion in an animal most people consider a nuisance? I never have a good answer, except maybe this. Sometimes the smallest lives teach us the biggest lessons. Acorn taught me about resilience, about trust, about the fierce will to survive that exists in all living things. He reminded me that every creature, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, has a place in this world and deserves a chance to find it. Most of all, he taught me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is to help something we love find the freedom to leave us. I don't know if Acorn remembers me. Groundhogs aren't known for their long memories or capacity for sentiment. But in a way, that makes what we shared all the more precious. It was pure, uncluttered by expectation or obligation. I asked for nothing in return for my care except the privilege of watching him grow strong enough to no longer need it. And in the end, isn't that what all love should be?